On July 12, 1989, in the Goethe Forest east of Lüneburg, Germany, the bodies of a family of two who had gone on a picnic were discovered. Their killer had to be an exceptionally cold-blooded individual because just as police were examining the crime scene, he was already out searching for his next victims. And he found them. Soon after, the wife of a wealthy businessman vanished without a trace in Lüneburg. But her disappearance attracted little attention due to the Goethe murders. A grave mistake, as would become clear nearly 3 decades later, because hidden in that very case was the key to uncovering the identity of Germany's most unusual serial killer. He committed murders that kept the entire northern part of the country on edge, and the fact that some of his crimes have now been solved, finally giving families the answers they long for, is thanks to one investigator who had lost his own sister. On the morning of August 15, 1989, the phone rang in Wolfgang Siloff's office. "Mom is missing," he heard through sobs. The voice belonged to Yasmin, the 20-year-old daughter of his younger sister, 41-year-old Birgit Meyer. Wolfgang immediately knew that his sister wouldn't have simply vanished and abandoned her daughter. Even though Yasmin was no longer a child, she and her mother shared a very close and trusting bond. At the time, Wolfgang was the head of the Criminal Investigation Department, LKA, in Hamburg. However, even someone as influential as he was unable to persuade the police in the city of Lüneburg, where Birgit lived, to conduct a thorough investigation into her disappearance. There were 2 reasons for this. First, the Lüneburg police were already fully occupied with investigating 2 double murders, which had become their top priority. Second, and perhaps more critically, they had a suspect from the very beginning. Birgit's husband, Harold Meyer, a successful businessman in the printing industry. Harold had separated from Birgit just months before her disappearance and had already begun seeing another woman. Birgit, who was not working at the time, struggled more with the impending divorce and at times sought comfort in alcohol. Yet on the evening of August 14, 1989, Birgit greeted her husband with a smile. Harold had come over to discuss the terms of their separation, and it seemed that Birgit had finally come to terms with her emotions. The conversation was reportedly amicable. They agreed that Birgit would receive 500,000 Deutschmarks and move out of the family home near Lüneburg. The next day, they were to meet at the notary's office. However, on the morning of July 12th, Jasmine discovered her mother was missing. Her Opel Cabriolet was parked in the garage, but the woman herself was nowhere to be found in the house. As would later become known, her documents had also disappeared. Apart from a shoe print near Birgit's house, there were no signs of a crime, no blood, no struggle. According to Birgit's husband, the previous evening had passed normally and they had not argued. After the husband left, the woman spoke on the phone with her mother and daughter and also said that she and her husband had not fought and that the meeting went well. However, despite Harold's statements, the police suspected that the husband had found another way to get rid of his wife and avoid paying her 500,000. Today, Harold Meyer still lives in the very house from which his wife vanished without a trace. He recalls that Birgit had always remained his friend, someone he could completely rely on. However, many believed Harold was guilty, first of her disappearance and then of her murder. He constantly heard whispers. His friends quietly wondered whether he had taken Birgit away in his Porsche and disposed of her body at sea from a motorboat. Even in his own daughter's gaze, there were moments where a silent question seemed to flash. Could he know something about what happened to her mother? Could the police be right in their suspicions? Only Wolfgang Siloff believed that Harold had nothing to do with his sister's disappearance, because Birgit and Harold had never argued over money. When Birgit met Harold that evening, 32 years ago, she was dressed beautifully, and he noticed she had had a drink or two to lift her mood. He teased her, suggesting she probably wasn't planning to spend the evening alone. She playfully replied, "Who knows?" Now he believes that in that moment, her killer may have already been nearby, waiting for the right opportunity to strike. However, it was only 6 weeks after Birgit disappeared that Harold first became suspicious about what might have happened that day. A colleague of his wife told him that on the day she vanished, Birgit had cheerfully mentioned the neighbor's gardener. Allegedly, he had rung Birgit's doorbell, introduced himself, and asked how to get to the neighboring house, even though he already knew the address. Harold didn't know what to make of it. He remembered a party at the neighbor's, where the gardener had also been present. A quiet, silent man, blonde with very handsome features, but a chilling stare. Harold recalled being deeply unsettled by the cold, assessing look in his icy eyes. He later found out that Birgit had met him a few months before her disappearance at that very same party. She had drunk a bit too much, and the gardener had walked her home. Harold reported this man to the police. Investigators found out that the gardener, who also worked part-time at a cemetery, was named Kurt-Werner Wichmann, a handsome but extremely dangerous man. Even as a child, he had threatened a young mother and her baby with a knife. In early adulthood, he abducted a hitchhiking girl, sexually assaulted her, and nearly killed her. After that attack, he spent 5.5 years in prison. Investigators decided to speak with Wichmann in person and invited him to the station. He arrived wearing gloves, explaining that he had an allergy. The man claimed he had an alibi for the time of the woman's disappearance. After work, he had spent the entire evening at home and only went out briefly to walk his German Shepherd around 10 p.m., which he said lasted no more than 15 minutes. His wife confirmed his story. Wichmann wisely chose not to mention that on the day Birgit disappeared, he was actually on sick leave and didn't need to go to work at all. It would have been incredibly easy for police to verify this, but surprisingly, not a single investigator considered Wichmann a serious suspect. Wolfgang later noted that, at the very least, a preliminary investigation should have been launched, but it never happened. Anytime he tried to ask for more details, the conversations would abruptly end. Days turned into months and months into years, until a new prosecutor in Lüneburg took over the case. It wasn't until 1993, 3.5 years after Birgit's disappearance, that a formal criminal case was opened against Kurt-Werner Wichmann on suspicion of murdering Birgit Meyer. On a cold February morning in 1993, police knocked on the door of a brick house on the outskirts of Lüneburg, the home of Kurt-Werner Wichmann. His wife answered. Her husband wasn't home. The officers presented a search warrant and got to work. A sniffer dog immediately led them to a recently demolished drywall partition in the basement. On the ground floor, they noticed a soundproof door. Wichmann's wife explained that she didn't have a key, only her husband and his brother did. The officers forced the door open, revealing a true arsenal: 2 small-caliber rifles, a revolver, silencers, ammunition, stun guns, knives, sleeping pills, chains, cords, and blood-stained handcuffs. The police confiscated it all. While searching the property surrounding the house, a metal detector went off. With the help of an excavator, police unearthed something extraordinary in Wichmann's garden: an entire vehicle, a brand new, bright red Ford sports coupe. On the back seat, forensic experts found traces of blood. The sniffer dog also clearly reacted to the scent of a body in the car, but there was no body to be found. A bit later, police discovered a Volkswagen Golf parked near Lüneburg, registered to Wichmann. Inside were road maps, a sleeping bag, a thermos, and binoculars, gear more suited to a hunter or someone who spends long periods tracking people they plan to kill. For several weeks, Kurt managed to evade law enforcement. However, on April 15, 1993, an accident occurred on a rural road near Heilbronn. Police inspected the vehicle, which held 2 men. Weapons were found inside, so the driver was taken to the station. There, it was discovered that the driver was Kurt, and the man next to him was his younger brother. At the police station, officers didn't consider Kurt a danger to himself, so they did not confiscate his belt. On April 25, 1993, Kurt was found dead in his prison cell. He was 43 years old. The police quickly closed the case, as under German criminal procedure law, deceased individuals cannot be the subject of an investigation. But this was far from the end. In fact, it marked the beginning of an inquiry that would eventually uncover some of the most horrifying crimes in the country's history. In 2002, Wolfgang retired and was finally able to devote more time and attention to his sister's case. He gained access to the case files and was horrified. To his shock, he discovered that all the evidence had been destroyed, including the red Ford that had been unearthed. Even the basement in Kurt's house, where the sniffer dog had detected the scent of human remains, had never been thoroughly investigated. In Wolfgang's view, the evidence should have been preserved. First, because there is no statute of limitations for murder in Germany, and second, because the principle of not investigating deceased suspects didn't apply here. There was still another person under suspicion: Birgit's husband, Harold. To either exonerate or implicate him, police needed to examine all the evidence, question Wichmann's neighbors, and conduct a proper investigation. But now much of that was no longer possible. Still, Wolfgang refused to give up. He assembled a small team of former colleagues who volunteered their time. Over and over, they analyzed motives, the possible sequence of events, and the behavior of the perpetrator. Finally, a new theory emerged. Birgit's disappearance might be linked to other unsolved crimes. Searching for proof, Wolfgang returned to Wichmann's house. The hidden room had changed little since it was first discovered in 1993. There, he found recordings of 2 TV programs, one about Birgit Meyer's disappearance, the other about the Gurda murders. Wolfgang immediately alerted the Lüneburg police, but nothing happened. For years, the cases remained officially unsolved. In 2015, a new chief was appointed at the Lüneburg Criminal Police Office. Wolfgang succeeded in convincing him to form a special commission to review his sister's case. The commission was led by Richard Kaufmann, an experienced, and in the best sense of the word, meticulous investigator who had solved every case he'd handled in recent years. Kaufmann discovered that on the handcuffs found in Wichmann's hidden room, there was a tiny drop of blood. The sample hadn't been destroyed because it had been stored at the Medical University of Hanover. A DNA comparison confirmed that the blood belonged to Birgit Meyer. There was now no doubt that Wichmann had shackled Birgit with the handcuffs and most likely killed her. The investigator hypothesized that Wichmann may have intended to kidnap Birgit and demand a ransom from her husband, Harold. But something went wrong. And clearly, there must have been at least 2 people involved in the abduction, since a neighbor reported hearing the sound of a car engine running that night. Where could Birgit's body have been? The investigator examined several graves that had been dug in the cemetery where Wichmann had once worked, but Birgit Meyer wasn't among them. That's when Wolfgang decided to dig deeper into the man's past. First of all, Wichmann was not a troubled boy from a loving family. His father often threatened his mother with an axe and was violent toward his sons. Young Kurt-Werner Wichmann ended up in the Wickenstift Social Institution and, after returning from New Year's holidays in 1964, didn't want to go back. But he needed money to escape. So at the age of 14, he broke into the apartment of one of his parents' tenants, a young mother with a baby, armed with a dagger and a flashlight. The woman woke up to the light, screamed, and Wichmann briefly strangled her to silence her. Then he turned toward the child. For a moment, the mother feared he would hurt her baby, but fortunately, he changed his mind. Unfortunately, the girl whom 22-year-old Kurt offered a ride in 1970 wasn't so lucky. He picked her up while she was hitchhiking, drove into the woods and attacked her. After getting what he wanted, he partially strangled her and threw her into the trunk, presumably to bury her later. But something incredible happened. When he opened the trunk again, the girl had regained consciousness and managed to talk him into letting her go, claiming he had nothing to fear from her. 2 days later, when Wichmann read a newspaper article about the attack, he realized it didn't match how he remembered it. So what did he do? He went to the police, supposedly to clarify some details. As a result, those clarifications earned him 5.5 years in prison. Understanding the kind of person Kurt was, Wolfgang came to a conclusion. Wichmann was obsessed with control. He was a narcissist who cared deeply about how he was perceived. That need to control was so strong, he even turned himself in after a crime, just to manage the narrative. So of course he had to control where his victim's body was hidden. Wolfgang suspected Birgit's remains might be hidden on Wichmann's own property, perhaps even inside the house. It was a painful thought, especially since he had begged the Lüneburg police years earlier to conduct a thorough search of that house. But they dismissed his concerns. The head of the investigation team told him his criminal experience told him Birgit wasn't there. When he said that, he was standing just above her body, separated from it by nothing but a concrete slab. Years later, Wolfgang finally had the garage floor dug up. Beneath the concrete, he found what remained of his sister. The autopsy revealed that Birgit Meyer had been killed with a gunshot to the head. The Birgit Meyer case had been solved, but Wolfgang decided not to stop there, remembering the other families still waiting for answers about the crimes that had affected their loved ones. And so, thanks solely to Wolfgang's persistence, by the end of 2017, a case that had once terrified all of northern Germany in the 1990s was reopened and finally solved: the Gurda murders. In July 1989, northern Germany was experiencing hot, sunny weather, and many people sought relief in the cool shade of the forest. On July 12, 1989, just 2 days before Birgit's disappearance, 3 people picking blueberries in Gurda were suddenly overwhelmed by a nauseatingly sweet smell. Trying to find the source, they spotted a human hand under a pine tree. As it turned out, back on May 21, 1989, a married couple from Hamburg, 51-year-old Peter and 45-year-old Ursula Reynolds, had gone on a picnic in the forest, hoping to enjoy a relaxing day outdoors. Both were brutally murdered, and their bodies were dragged far from the site of the attack. When found, the couple was nearly naked. It remained unclear whether the killer had undressed them or if they had done so themselves before the attack. The killer took their picnic basket, binoculars, and car keys, and then drove off in their car. The vehicle was later found in another city. Though the couple had been reported missing, their bodies were not found for 7 weeks. Due to the summer heat, little remained of their corpses, and the cause of death could not be determined. However, robbery was ruled out, as valuables were still found on the bodies. Since mobile phones didn't exist yet, the berry pickers rushed to find a forest ranger to contact the police. But what truly terrified the public and earned Gord the chilling nickname, the Forest of Death, it was the shocking fact that, while police were still investigating the remains of Peter and Ursula, the killer struck again, murdering another couple just 800 meters from the ongoing crime scene. On July 12, 1989, 46-year-old Ingrid Wormbier and 43-year-old Bernd Michael Kopping from Hanover had also arrived in Gorda. The two were married, but not to each other, which is why they had chosen the seclusion of the forest. After parking their car, they walked about 2 kilometers deeper into the woods. Both were brutally murdered. Once again, the killer took their Polaroid camera and car keys and drove away. It was later confirmed that he used their car for about a week before abandoning it. Their bodies were found by chance 2 weeks later, during a police search in connection with the first murder. The 2 crime scenes were only 800 meters apart. However, later testing revealed that, due to the location of the murders in low-lying forested areas, the officers working the first scene would not have heard the gunshots. With this new discovery, a seemingly minor encounter suddenly took on greater importance. As the blueberry pickers rushed to alert the ranger, they crossed paths with a man. Of course, after 2 weeks, their description was vague, but they remembered a tall, fit man in his 40s, a brunette with medium-length hair, no glasses, no beard. He was carrying a bag, clearly not empty. Based on their account, a composite sketch was created, even if it turned out the man had nothing to do with the crime. What these murders had in common was that they were committed in the same area of a vast forest. Additionally, the victims were both middle-aged. In 2 cases, the killer stole the victims' belongings, although it wasn't a typical robbery. He left the crime scenes using the victims' cars, then abandoned the vehicles in small towns with railway connections. Both towns lie on the Hanover-Hamburg route, and these parallels led investigators to suspect that the same person was responsible. In 1989, Wichmann was 40 years old and lived about 30 kilometers from Gerdi. On the day the secret lovers were murdered, he was on sick leave. The married couple was killed on a Sunday, also a day when Kurt did not have to work. However, the investigators originally assigned to the Gerda murders found no evidence linking Wichmann to the Gerda crime scenes. Moreover, he did not resemble the composite sketch. Therefore, the police focused on other suspects. In particular, they suspected that the deceived husband of the second crime's victim had hired a professional to deal with his unfaithful wife and her lover. But this man accidentally killed the wrong 2 people before completing the job. Once again, Wolfgang could not understand the investigators' decision. He and his team of colleagues immediately suspected that Kurt fit the profile of the Gerda killer. The brutality of the crimes, the intimate nature revealed by the women's disheveled clothing, all matched Wichmann's profile. Moreover, many years ago, Wolfgang had found a video recording in Kurt's secret room, an episode of the TV show Aktenzeichen XY that covered the Gerda murders. Kurt, being a narcissist, also collected video recordings and newspaper clippings about Birgit Meyer. There was also evidence that the man had searched for information about relatives of Bernd Michael Kopping, who was killed in Gerda. But the final breakthrough in the case, as often happens today, came from DNA analysis. The Gerda killer had a habit of driving his victims' cars for several days. In one of the vehicles, 3 hairs and possibly other biological material were found. However, it took almost 30 years before the DNA in the car was compared with Kurt's. Only at the end of 2017 did the analysis return a result, a match. The perpetrator of the 2 Gerda murders was Kurt-Werner Wichmann. After this discovery, a special investigative team was formed in Lüneburg to analyze the murders committed by Wichmann and to create a criminal profile. It was assumed he might be connected to up to 24 other murders. The police also planned to analyze similar crimes in other European countries, suspecting Wichmann could be involved. However, in early 2020, the police announced that they had examined half of the collected evidence, and aside from 5 murders conclusively linked to Wichmann, they could not establish connections to other cases. The question of motives and at least one other person involved in all of his cases remains open. If he left Gerda in the victim's cars, how did he get to Gerda in the first place? And what was the noise of a running engine that Birgit's neighbor heard? There is a man who knew Kurt better than anyone else, but will he talk to the police? This is Kurt's brother, 10 years younger. He was very dependent on his brother and asked him for advice on everything, even the smallest matters. In his farewell letters, Kurt gave him instructions that can be interpreted as coded messages. For example, he told him to clean the drain above the basement entrance once, but very carefully. A rather strange final request, isn't it? Surely he knows more than he will ever reveal about his brother in his life. A small, quiet, silent man, the complete opposite of his brother, or maybe not.